Well, thank you so much, Chris, for that lovely warm welcome. I want to begin this evening by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I repay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal people here this evening. I want to say from the outset that it's a great privilege to be invited to address you all tonight, and I would particularly like to acknowledge the presence of my new colleagues from the University of New South Wales. We all know now that education matters, and a generation ago, if a young person left school at 15, chances are that we would have said, "So what?" It's not the same now. Since 2010, it's been a requirement in New South Wales that young people participate in some form of education and training until the age of 17. A generation ago, widespread basic skills were enough to ensure general economic prosperity as well as equitable access to a good life. Today, globalisation and technological change, amongst other things, have raised the bar. Australia faces competition from existing and emerging economies, and our place amongst the most competitive, high-value-add economies is not secure. Research demonstrates that better educated countries are more prosperous, and more and better quality schooling drives our GDP growth in Australia. In our country, the benefit of increasing Year 12 completion rates to 90% by 2015 is estimated to increase our GDP annually by around 0.65% over the period from 2010 to 2040. In New South Wales, in Australia and elsewhere, an individual's educational attainment is a significant predictor of success and well-being throughout their life, and much of the evidence of this will come as no surprise as many of you here tonight. We do know, for example, that Year 12 is the starting point for higher wage premiums. Individuals completing Year 12 earn, on average, over 25% more than those who haven't completed secondary education, and those with a bachelor or higher degrees earn, on average, 73% and 82% more, respectively. Secondly, the wage premium for degrees has risen since 2001, and even as the population with higher degrees has expanded by 30% since 2001. Economic returns on education to Aboriginal people are even higher. Employed Aboriginal people who have completed Year 12 are about 60 percentage points more likely to earn above the national median wage than those who have not completed Year 12. According to the most recent National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Survey data, which was 2008, 18.5% of Aboriginal people who had only completed Year 9 or below had been tested in the previous 5-year period, compared with 11.8% of Aboriginal people who had completed Year 12. So education matters, and particularly to our most vulnerable communities. We also know the importance of education to national and individual well-being begins in early childhood. Early childhood education fosters cognitive skills along with attentiveness, motivation, self-control and sociability, and the character skills that turn knowledge into know-how and people into productive citizens. And we do know that education is also strongly linked to better health and lower crime rates, conferring individual, social and quantifiable economic benefits. For example, individuals with bachelor degrees or higher are half as likely to suffer arthritis, to smoke, or to suffer heart attack, stroke or vascular disease. So education also impacts on the quality of our lives. People may be less familiar with the evidence that 50% of the income premium from higher level qualifications is attributable to higher wages, and the rest comes from reduced vulnerability to economic downturn. A qualification at the level of Certificate 1 and 2 may no longer be reasonably held to be the equivalent of Year 12, at least in terms of the median weekly earnings. For a Year 12 completer, Certificate 3 or Certificate 4 level, those qualifications don't deliver advantage, although they're highly significant for our non-completers of Year 12. And with regards to Indigenous students, we all know that their educational outcomes lag deplorably behind their non-Indigenous peers. However, it is less well known that higher levels of education appear to provide the means to maintain one's language and culture. The difference between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in terms of educational outcomes explains a large component of the gap in health. And if we're right, and we're certainly right to be confronted by the evidence that the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians is firmly established in the early years, but widens over a student's educational journey. There is indeed a so what here, but it is a so what of a completely different kind to be asked. A more relevant and a more pressing question is so what we need to ask is to be done. We don't need the Finnish educational expert Pasi Sahlberg to tell us that effecting real educational change is hard, although we may value his reminder of purpose, its moral obligation as much as its economic imperative. In fact, not only is real change, that is sustained, systemic change, difficult to bring about in education, any change is hard. The US provides us of a sobering example, and in Sahlberg's words, he says, in the past decade, the burdening economies of India and China have provoked the United States commissions and initiatives to advocate the teaching of 21st century skills, tougher curriculum requirements, common national standards, yet more testing, increased competition between teachers and schools, and harder work for everybody. Nevertheless, over the last quarter of a century, the standards and performance of American teachers and schools have steadily declined in relation to international benchmarks. Now, we do know that Australia performs well by international testing standards, but we've been forced to face evidence of a decline in the last round of PISA testing. In 2009, the mean PISA reading scores for Australia and New South Wales were significantly higher than the OECD average. PISA shows, however, a decline in reading and literacy standards from 2000 to 2009, both at the bottom and indeed at the top end of performance. And that pattern is replicated for mathematical literacy standards between 2003 and 2009. The slippage is relative as well as absolute. And in 2000, only 2 countries performed significantly higher than Australia in mathematical literacy, and by 2009, however, that number had grown to 12. Our time series for NAPLAN is too short for definitive judgments about significant change, but between 2008 and 11, what we see is there's been very little change in NAPLAN reading or numeracy results for years 3 or 5 in New South Wales government schools. And that story is similar for year 7 and 9, and although the year 7 numeracy results are indeed showing signs of declining in performance, particularly at the top end, with the exception of year 5 numeracy, there has been no significant difference in mean reading and numeracy scores for Aboriginal student populations between 2008 and 2011. In fact, for year 7 and 9 numeracy, the percentage of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students below the national minimum standard has significantly increased between 2008 and 2011. And this is also true for year 9 Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students in the domain of reading. Well done standardised tests can provide an important picture of aggregate student achievement. But as every teacher knows, and they know quite well, that they are only part of the picture. And according to Trilling and Fidel in 1991, we faced a tipping point when the knowledge age expenditures exceeded the industrial age spending for the first time. And in that year they wrote, marked one of a new age of information, knowledge and innovation. Since then, countries around the globe have increasingly been spending on making, manipulating, managing and moving bits and bytes of information rather than on handling the material worlds of atoms and molecules. And I believe that the new importance of that knowledge work has huge implications for education. If knowledge and skills have become the global currency, as Andreas Schleicher observes, there is no central bank that prints this currency. You cannot inherit it, you cannot produce it through speculation, and you can only develop it through sustained effort and investment by people for people. We clearly need to consider the type of investment we make. It has been estimated that school students can expect to have more than 11 different jobs between the ages of 18 and 42, and it lends particular credence to Alvin Toffler's observation that the illiterate of the 21st century are not those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn and relearn. I guess tonight there's no need to rehearse here at any length the evidence that teachers are the single greatest in-school influence on student outcomes, and we know that teachers account for about 30% of the variance in student outcomes. It is what teachers know, do and care about which is very powerful in the learning equation. And it follows from that that the quality of an education system cannot exceed the quality of its teachers. Summarising the literature on the effect of teacher quality on student outcomes, the Grattan Institute report, Investing in Our Teachers, Investing in Our Economy, writes, in fact, the research findings on the relationship between teacher effectiveness and student performance are remarkably consistent. In the Australian context, conservative estimates suggest that a student with an effective teacher can achieve in 3/4 of a year what would take a full year with a less effective teacher. And those estimates echo international research, reporting that the gap in outcomes between a student who has a less effective teacher and a student who has a highly effective teacher can be as much as a full year's difference in achievement. And moreover, the effect of teaching quality is cumulative and particularly important for students from low SES backgrounds. The respected educational economist Eric Hanushek has estimated that if a student had a good teacher, as opposed to an average teacher, for 5 years in a row, the increased learning would be sufficient to close entirely the average gap between a typically low-income student and a student on a non-free lunch, which is a measure of low SES. To teach well is to meet the exacting professional standards of a modern-day knowledge workers. And as an indicative statement, the OECD's comparative review of innovative learning environments concludes a number of things. The first of those is that teachers need to be well versed in subjects they teach in order to do well using different methods and, if necessary, changing their approaches to optimise learning. And that includes content-specific strategies and methods to teach specific content. Secondly, they need a rich repertoire of teaching strategies, the ability to combine approaches and the knowledge of how and when to use certain methods and strategies. And thirdly, those strategies used should include direct whole-group teaching, guided discovery, group work, and the facilitation of self-study and individual discovery. And they also should include the important step of personalised feedback. Teachers need to be able to work in highly collaborative ways, working with other teachers, professionals, paraprofessionals within the same organisation or with individuals in other organisations, networks of professional communities and different partnership arrangements which may include mentoring teachers. Teachers need to acquire strong skills in technology and use technology as an effective teaching tool to both optimise the use of digital resources in their teaching and to use information management systems to track student learning. And teachers need to develop the capacity to help design, lead, manage and to plan learning environments in collaboration with others. But last but indeed not least, teachers need to reflect on their practices in order to learn from their experience. And that's a formidable task. So what do we need to do to ensure that new and existing teachers have the knowledge, skills and resources to meet those exacting standards? Affecting a sustained, systemic, statewide and then national lift in student achievement is dependent upon a similarly sustained lift in teaching quality. Affecting a sustained lift in teaching quality means paying attention to teaching quality across the teaching life cycle. In the first instance, from a systemic point of view, we need to consider the structure of that life cycle. And as we have seen, we can no longer assume that we have single linear careers, indeed in the future will be a dominant model. We need, and I'm increasingly convinced, to map out a network of deliberately planned pathways for teachers who are moving into, through and importantly, I believe, re-entering our systems after a period of absence. Those pathways need to acknowledge the realities of part-time as well as full-time work. And in the face of ongoing social and labour force change, we need to design an education system through design and deliberation, not simply by default. Within this network of pathways, we need to make sure that all teachers, whether they are new, of long experience or re-entering the workforce after a break, have the support that they need to maintain currency of content knowledge and pedagogical practice. And that may be easier said than done. And I draw from the OECD report, Preparing Teachers and Developing School Leaders for the 21st Century. The body of evidence on how children learn has grown greatly over the past years, but this knowledge base has not always had a profound impact on teacher practice in the classroom. For example, Trilling and Fidel cite the conflict between research into the cognitive science of learning and instruction, which has demonstrated that content mastery and its application are intertwined, and common lockstep models of learning which assume that knowledge must precede application. And I believe as educators, both within education systems and indeed within university faculties, how do we meet our shared responsibility to ensure that all teachers are equipped to draw upon that important repertoire of appropriate and effective strategies? What, to borrow the words of Schleicher, does it take to improve the use and dissemination of proved and promising teaching practices? How do we generate and share cumulative knowledge in our education sector? Firstly, absolutely necessary, although I believe not sufficient, is that we need to ensure that teachers have access to a broad and robust evidence base on the effectiveness of different pedagogic approaches in different circumstances. That evidence base needs to be broad because lifting achievement of all students means lifting the achievement of many individuals using personalised education approaches. The evidence base needs to be robust for two critical reasons. The first of those is because, as busy modern professionals with significant demands on their time, teachers deserve no less. And the second reason is because the students they teach won't be coming back next year to learn to read the better way. Ensuring that teachers have access to a broad and robust evidence base is important, but not itself sufficient to lift quality of teaching. The ways in which the evidence base is used to inform and shape classroom practice is of more interest. As educationalists, we have also had an ongoing and a shared responsibility to build that evidence base and we equally have a shared responsibility to communicate the findings in a way that will ensure that this evidence informs the choices that we make and the advice that we provide. In New South Wales, we've made significant advances in this area through the implementation of our strategic approach to evaluation of the Smarter Schools National Partnership programs, because we've taken seriously the need for evaluations to deliver meaningful insights. We are not yet in possession of the findings, but good evaluation, like educational reform, requires patience because it takes time. While we're waiting for this, we need to turn our attention to developing a much better understanding of how teachers expand their repertoire of teaching skills. How do they connect with research in the field, both subject-specific and more broadly pedagogic? How do they and when do they use research and other input to recalibrate their thinking and change their teaching practice? We may also need to rethink our approach to teacher professional development. It's not necessarily a quantum or indeed a question of quantum, although TALIS data does indicate that Australian teachers participate in fewer days of professional learning in the 18 months prior to that survey than many of their international peers. What I find more interesting is that TALIS's evidence of the disconnection between those forms of professional learning that teachers are most likely to feel have a large impact on their development as a teacher, and those forms in which they indeed more frequently engage. For example, while virtually 90% of the TALIS teachers felt that individual and collaborative research had a moderate or high impact on their work, only around 35% participated in it. The high value of individual and collaborative research is borne out by the structure of teaching work in a number of high-achieving countries. In Finland, the basic requirement for permanent employment as a teacher in all comprehensive and upper secondary schools is the possession of a research-based master's degree. Sahlberg argues that this contributes to the shared Finnish understanding that the teaching profession is based on scholarly research and the understanding and production of scientific evidence. Hong Kong, Shanghai, Singapore, Korea all also focus on the creation of a strong culture of teacher education, research, collaboration, mentoring, feedback and sustained professional development. In Australia in the past, the concept of classroom observation, teacher collaboration and peer review has sometimes, in some places, been viewed as an attack on teacher professionalism and autonomy, associated with unhelpful forms of surveillance and appraisal, rather than being on that constructive feedback side. TALIS information would suggest, however, that we have an important opportunity to reconceive such activities in a positive light, given the high value that new teachers, in particular, accord appraisal and feedback on their classroom teaching. Over 88% of new teachers surveyed agreed that their appraisal and feedback was helpful in the development of their work as a teacher, compared with 78% of more experienced teachers. And interestingly, in Australia, it was one of those countries with the largest difference in results for new and experienced teachers. We have at the same time to be mindful that initiatives must live up to their stated aims, and indeed the same research data also demonstrates that the existence of mentoring programs does not of itself indicate a more developed culture of professional collaboration in the way that one might expect. New teachers who work in schools with induction or mentoring programs are not substantially more likely to receive more frequent appraisal and feedback than other new teachers. And indeed, what was surprising to me was that of those new teachers who work in schools with induction or mentoring programs, nearly half of them reported that the programs did not facilitate regular feedback. So naturally, our efforts to improve the quality of teaching in our schools must begin in collaboration with our education system's greatest assets, our teachers. At the same time, we must be mindful of the need to make sure we have the right teachers in our schools in the first place. Queensland has taken a particular approach to this, as many of you may know, with the introduction of a pre-registration test for teachers undertaken during the course of their pre-service training. It is not clear what outcomes of this, indeed this approach will be, but I would argue that we also need to take a step back further and make sure, first of all, we attract the right candidates to the teaching profession in the first place, that we prepare these candidates in the right way for their tasks in our schools, we select the right candidates for positions in our teaching education institutions, and we take particular care in constructing relevant and engaging courses of studies. Nevertheless, it is true that high-achieving countries tend to share certain characteristics when it comes to the teaching profession, including ensuring that teachers are recruited from amongst the best and the brightest of an age cohort. The AITSL Standards and Procedures for the Accreditation of Initial Teacher Education Programs in Australia of April 2011 acknowledge the intellectual demands of teacher education courses and indeed teaching itself in one of the standards, in Standard 3, that are related to program entrance. And it really captures that all entrants to initial teacher education will successfully demonstrate their capacity to engage effectively with a rigorous higher education program and to carry out the intellectual demands of teaching itself. And indeed, to achieve this, it's expected that applicants' levels of personal literacy and numeracy should be broadly equivalent to those of the top 30% of the population. Our New South Wales data suggests, however, there may be a way to go to realise this standard. In New South Wales, in 2011, more than a quarter of direct school leaver entrants into initial teacher education courses had ATAR scores in the bottom half of the HSC distribution. And most recently, the Australian reported that education was the least popular course for students with ATARs of 90 and above, and that only 6.5% of education places were offered to students with indeed ATARs below 50. It is true that academic achievement is not a sufficient predictor of a student's potential to be a good or indeed even a great teacher, that some students who may go on to be excellent educators come themselves to academic excellence a little later in life. But these may be the exception that proves the rule. While personal experience and evidence would suggest that experience also contributes significantly to teaching quality, it is less clear within what parameters this might be true. The number of months or years required to achieve higher quality teaching is not well known, nor is the point at which diminishing returns become a factor. In fact, the OECD report on the experience of new teachers cites research demonstrating that the increases in teachers' effectiveness between the first and the second years of their careers are much larger than subsequent gains. Moreover, it appears that differences in the teacher's effectiveness do not reduce over time. Teachers who are less effective don't appear to catch up to their more effective counterparts as they progress through their careers. In fact, teachers who are more effective in their first year of teaching tend to progress at a faster rate than their less effective colleagues. So such findings really put the onus for all of us to get back on getting initial teacher education right, together with support for teachers in their first year of service, and we need to do this together. A powerful strategy for building the capacity of all teachers lies in the design and delivery of quality initial teacher education. And according to the 2000 Staff in Australian Schools survey, fewer than 1/3 of early career teachers rate their pre-service education course highly for teaching students with learning difficulties, teaching students from Indigenous backgrounds, or teaching students from different cultural backgrounds. And similarly, the TALIS data shows that Australian teachers in their first 2 years of teaching are 8 times more likely to identify a need for professional development in classroom management and 6 times more likely to identify a need in student discipline and behaviour problems than their more experienced Australian colleagues, a differential which is significantly greater than other participating countries in that survey. A differential that is all the more concerning given our knowledge that 20% of the vacancies in our hard-to-staff New South Wales government schools, i.e. those schools with disadvantaged and possibly more challenging students, are filled by first-year teachers. So what do we conclude from this? First of all, finish masters or no finish masters, in our own context, we need to make sure that our initial teacher education programs have the right balance between theoretical and practical, which may be the benefits of the movement which we see towards the more clinical models of teaching. And secondly, I believe very strongly that we need to get the practicum right. The practicum is the most important part of teacher preparation. Through its nature and quality, it does vary widely across the state. The AITSL standards attend properly to the need to quality assure the processes placed in our practicum. However, we also need to consider the pressures placed on the practicum by ongoing acute imbalances of teacher supply and demand. In New South Wales, universities annually produce approximately 5,500 teacher education graduates, while the New South Wales government schools employ 140 to 200 new graduates directly out of 1,800 to 2,000 new teacher appointments. And our completion data shows that primary teaching completions rose 66% between 2002 and 2010, well in excess of the education sector's workforce needs. There are approximately 18,000 practicum placements annually in New South Wales, of which government schools host around 16,500. And New South Wales schools and universities are both struggling to meet the demands for practicum placements, despite the fact that many teacher education students will neither seek nor gain employment as teachers. When so much of teaching quality agenda is playing itself out on the national stage, what imperative is there for our collective action as a New South Wales education community? Well, first, in the Australian education context, New South Wales is a highly significant player. In New South Wales, we have in excess of 1 million students, we have in excess of 80,000 teachers and just over 3,000 schools. And that roughly equates or represents 32 to 33% of the national totals. If our teachers are not offering our students educational opportunities of sufficiently high quality, not only will their educational outcomes suffer, but at the aggregate level, so will the nation's economic well-being. Just think, we're educating 1/3 of the nation's future workforce here in New South Wales. Secondly, we need to ensure our own ongoing well-being as a state. While indeed Australia has weathered recent economic crises as well, it has been due in large part to the mining boom in Queensland and Western Australia, benefits which will not necessarily accrue to New South Wales. We need to assume that our fortunes will ride on our people's skills, no longer on the sheep's back, or to be found at the bottom of a deep hole. What are the first steps in this rapidly changing world that we should take? Well, perhaps a leaf from the 21st Century Skills Cyberbook, which emphasises the critical importance of communication and collaboration alongside critical thinking and problem solving. And one of the things that I don't think that we've done particularly well in the past is to foster that a most productive working relationship between the school education sector and the educational research community. I think this is essential if we expect our teachers to embrace both the quantitative and qualitative evidence base of their profession, as well as developing the art of its practice. It is also essential if we're to build with due deliberation the well-designed system which I alluded to earlier. I think we need to look closely and we need to change the architecture of the system, the shape of its component parts, the way in which it fits together. It's a complex business, but as Abraham Lincoln observed, the best way to predict the future is indeed to create it. To create the best future system that we can, we need to understand the nature and the value of each other's roles. And from my perspective as an educationalist, with the responsibility and indeed the privilege of providing advice to government, it is incumbent on me and my colleagues to ensure that our advice is informed by the best evidence that there is, even and indeed especially if that doesn't demonstrate what we'd like or what we'd expect it to be. And from my perspective as an educationalist affiliated with the research community, it's incumbent on me and my colleagues to understand the exciting but sometimes very frustrating parameters of the policy window, which rarely stays open long enough for the completion of the longitudinal study. The danger of outlining the task of this magnitude and difficulty is that rather than understanding our work better, we come away from the exchange disheartened. I hope and trust that this is not what happens this evening. Yes, we have our work cut out if we are to achieve the kinds of shifts in educational outcomes via the kinds of shifts in teaching quality in our schools that our student and our nation deserve. We don't yet have all the answers, and it may take time to come to consensus about the best approaches to take. But I'm certainly confident that we have one invaluable asset in this task, and that is a shared sense of purpose. We should build upon this shared sense of purpose, and our collective challenge is to make stronger the connections between institutions and organisations in the best educational interests of the current and next generations. A purpose that I couldn't hope to articulate better than Hank Levin, Professor of Education at Columbia University, when he indeed reminded us that those children that parents send to us are the only ones they have. They don't have another reserve set at home to send us if we make a mistake with the first set. Parents don't have a spare set of children, and children don't have spare lives. Given that we know just how much education matters, it's incumbent on us, perhaps in the way of nothing else, to get that right. Thank you.